Hey guys, tonight we slip onto a moonlit deck where the boards feel colder than they should, and the air carries that strange ocean hush that makes you wonder if the sea is holding its breath for you, or waiting to see what you'll do next. You're stepping into Anne Bonny's night, a space between waves, where history softens around the edges, and even the stars seem to lean in a little closer to listen. And sure, if you were actually on an 18th century pirate ship, you probably wouldn't survive the first day. But luckily, we're just floating in the story now, as safe as a tightly sealed cup of hot cocoa. If you enjoy these quiet journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, just breathe. Allow your eyes to grow heavy and your body to soften, and let the hush of winter carry you to sleep. Let's begin. You settle into the dim glow of the night, as if it's a worn blanket someone left out for anyone wandering too long. The ship beneath you rocks in that slow, steady rhythm that only a calm Caribbean night can manage, like the ocean is trying to lull you into trusting it. You know better, of course. The sea is ancient and occasionally petty. It has swallowed entire empires and probably doesn't care that you've had a long week. But tonight, it's in a particularly gentle mood, smoothing its own surface until it reflects the moon like a polished coin. You step closer to the railing, letting your fingers trail across the rough, salt-crusted wood. The moon hangs low, too bright for this hour, and it paints the planks in silver streaks that stretch like quiet invitations. This is where Anne Bonny prefers to walk when everyone else is asleep. When the drunken laughter dies, the rigging stops groaning, and the ocean takes over the conversation. You follow the rhythm she once followed, the simple act of pacing, letting thoughts loosen one at a time, the way knots soften after a long soak. There's an old mainstream history note floating in this moment, one you might have heard in school. The golden age of piracy wasn't nearly as golden as people like to pretend. Most pirates weren't just chasing adventure. They were escaping something: poverty, punishment, boredom, or the rigid expectations of a world that didn't leave room for people like them. Anne Bonny walked right through those narrow spaces and kept walking until she found the sea. That's the point where many historians nod and agree. She became one of the very few women who not only lived the pirate life, but shaped it. Of course, academic circles still argue about how much of her legend is truth and how much was exaggerated by gossip-hungry newspapers. Some even insist she wasn't as fire-hearted as the stories claim, though you get the feeling those historians have never held their breath in a hurricane. Tonight, though, you're not concerned with the debates. You're concerned with the quiet. The way moonlight makes even chaos look organized. The way the ship sways with the heavy confidence of something that has survived storms you probably would have cried through. And the way the night air tastes, sharp with salt, a little sweet with humidity, and carrying the faint scent of tar and rope, like a mixture someone created in a candle shop and later regretted. You walk the deck, letting your own thoughts bob in and out of focus. Maybe this is why Anne loved these hours. There's no crew shouting over one another, no arguments about rations, no calculations about speed or weather patterns. Just the sea and the mind, two entities equally prone to wandering into dark corners. There's a strange safety in that. A cold breeze lifts the edge of your hair, and you glance toward the open water. The the horizon disappears in the same way it does on long highway drives, melting into the dark where sky and sea stop pretending to be separate. You think about the weird little fact that sailors used to believe moonlight could make people lose their minds if they stared too long. Not because of superstition, but because the constant shine on the water messed with depth perception and sleep cycles. A lot of crew journals mention moon mad nights, which sounds like a great band name and also a very real occupational hazard. Anne would have walked through those nights anyway, refusing to let a lunar optical illusion boss her around. As you breathe in, the wood under your feet gives a soft, familiar creak. It's a sound almost as old as seafaring itself. Ships groaning like old storytellers who are annoyed you interrupted their nap. You place your palm on the railing again, feeling the uneven ridges where tools shape the planks by hand. These ships weren't perfect. They weren't built for comfort, but they were alive in their own way, flexing and whispering, reacting to wind and tide like a creature that carried hundreds of feet, dozens of dreams, and a handful of regrets. Far in the distance, you see the faint shimmer of a jellyfish bloom, a rare occurrence, and one early sailors thought signaled good luck at sea. Modern scientists say it usually means the water temperature has shifted or the currents are changing. Historians, of course, still debate which interpretation the old pirates believed, but you can imagine Anne seeing that glow and deciding it meant the universe was giving her a subtle thumbs up. She had a habit of interpreting omens in whatever way kept her moving forward. The night grows quieter, if that's possible. Even the ropes seem to stop swaying. You stand perfectly still, listening for something behind the silence, like a message tucked between the waves. This is the part of the night when your mind drifts into places you didn't plan to visit. Not the dramatic memories, but the soft ones. The texture of childhood grass, the echo of someone calling you home for dinner, the moment you realized the world was bigger than you were ready for. Anne had nights like this too. Her memory wasn't all fire and rebellion. Some pieces were just human. The calm between big choices. A lonely seabird cries out somewhere in the distance. A gull, maybe, or something stranger, since the Caribbean likes to invent birds just to confuse visiting sailors. You tilt your head and let the sound dissolve into the night. The moon hangs above you, brighter still, as if waiting for you to acknowledge it. You do. And in that moment, standing on this moonlit deck, you sense the beginning of the journey. Not the dramatic part, but the quiet part that comes first. The inhale before the decision. The stillness before the tide shifts. The breath before history sharpens into motion. For now, you simply exist in the soft silver light, following the faint footprints Anne once made along the planks. You ease into the next stretch of night without even realizing the scene has shifted. The moon hasn't moved much, but the air around you feels heavier, like the ocean is preparing to show you something tucked deep beneath its surface. As you lean against the railing, the deck fades, not vanishing, just softening, until you find yourself drifting into the tender, tangled shadows of Anne Bonny's early years. You're not stepping backward in time so much as walking along a shoreline where memory washes up in strangely intact pieces. And here, in the cool hush of the night, you start picking them up one by one. The world Anne was born into wasn't gentle, even on a good day. You feel it first in the texture of the soil under your imagined feet, South Carolina earth, still stubborn even when the wind tries to smooth it out. You're standing near her childhood home, a place where the air was sticky with heat and expectation. You sense the weight of a society that had tidy boxes for every kind of person, but refused to build one for a girl with her particular temperament. It's a familiar American story, really. Ambition squeezed into a mold too tight, passion dressed up as inconvenience, fire mistaken for misbehavior. As you sift through that early landscape, you catch on to a mainstream history point. Colonial life was equal parts opportunity and surveillance. Everyone watched everyone else, partly out of nosiness, partly out of survival instinct. And for someone like Anne, illegitimate, bold, raised by a father who'd already broken the local social code, normalcy wasn't just out of reach, it was never on the shelf to begin with. Historians usually explain her later rebellion as a reaction to these pressures, though they still debate whether it was anger, boredom, or pure restlessness that lit the first spark. You suspect it was all three, mixed in proportions only she understood. A warm breeze brushes past you, carrying the faint smell of smoke, kitchen smoke, hearth smoke, the kind that clings to childhood memories long after everything else fades. You follow that scent to the back stairs of her home, where you imagine Anne, much younger, sneaking out to watch the harbor lights flicker between branches. You can almost see her sitting there, not moving, not speaking, just staring at the rhythm of boats rocking in the marsh. She wouldn't have thought of it as yearning back then. Kids rarely have the vocabulary for the instincts that shape them. But you know the look. That quiet tilt of the head that says someone is already dreaming beyond the walls built around them. And because every childhood has its oddities, you stumble into one of the strange little facts that still echoes around her legend. There's a story, half rumor, half warning, about how young Anne once lost her temper and set part of her family's property on fire. Was it an accident? Was it justified rage? Was it exaggerated by people who found a fiery girl too unsettling to describe gently? Scholars still argue about it, stamping footnotes like they're trying to leave tracks deep enough to settle the matter. But you know how childhood stories go. They expand and shrink depending on who retells them. What matters is that even as a kid, she refused to shrink to fit the room. You step away from the smoke and into the quieter corners of her early life. The domestic scenes, the chores she probably ignored, the lessons she pushed back against, not with loud complaints, but with that quiet, stubborn tilt of the chin that says, "I hear you, but no." You find yourself walking past a table where fabric is being mended, the needle glinting as if it knows it will be abandoned mid-stitch. You brush your fingers along the edge of a wooden chair, imagining how often she sat there swinging her legs, already plotting her escape without knowing she was doing it. And then there's her father, a complicated man in a world that preferred uncomplicated roles. You don't dive too deep into him. He's not the center of this night. But you sense how his choices shaped her, how his exile from certain social circles made her understand early that belonging wasn't guaranteed. It's something you earn, negotiate, or steal, depending on the day. Maybe that's where she first learned the quiet defiance she'd later carry to sea. Maybe that's where you learn a bit about yourself, too. Standing here in her ghost-shadowed childhood yard, realizing how much of a person's path is set long before they start walking it consciously. A cicada hums somewhere to your left. a familiar southern sound, even in this nocturnal memory. It fills the air with an odd kind of comfort, like nature's way of saying, yes, this place was real. Yes, these people lived and sweated and stumbled their way through hot summers just like you would have. You let the hum wash over you, blending into the faint splash of distant tides. The water was always there in her childhood, just far enough to stay a possibility rather than a promise. You crouch down, touching the grass that brushes your fingertips. It's coarse, sun-baked, and unremarkable, yet somehow perfect for anchoring a girl who would later be anything but ordinary. You let your hand rest there a moment longer, feeling a softness hidden beneath the rough surface. Childhoods are like that, uneven textures covering something more fragile than anyone admits at the time. In the corner of your mind, you sense the first flicker of rebellion taking shape, a spark so small you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention. But you are paying attention. That's what this journey is, moving slowly enough through someone else's past to notice the quiet turning points, the unnoticed choices, the stillness before the leap. You stand, letting the night fold around you again. The memory dissolves, not disappearing, but slipping back into the tide of the story. You're left with the feeling of a girl growing up in a world too cramped for her, a fire waiting for the right wind, and that wind is beginning to rise. The warmth of the South Carolina night fades beneath your feet as the world tilts again, softly, like a hammock shifting under your weight, until the shadows brighten into a glare that feels unmistakably Caribbean. You squint a little, because Nassau sunlight is the kind that does not care about your comfort, your retinas, or your SPF. It lands on you with the same enthusiasm as a dog that hasn't seen you in 3 days. And without ceremony, you find yourself walking into Anne Bonny's next landscape, a place where heat bends the air and freedom smells faintly of spilled rum, tar, and overly ambitious dreams. You stand at the edge of Nassau's harbor, where the sand is too hot for barefoot decisions, and the breeze tastes like someone mixed sea salt with mischief. This is not the polished Bahamas you see in travel brochures. This is the Nassau of the early 1700s, the rough-edged capital of the pirate republic, a place where rules were more of a suggestion and personal space was a luxury no one invented yet. You feel the texture of the street beneath you, uneven boards in some places, packed sand in others, both equally determined to trip you if you aren't looking. The first thing you notice is the noise. Even during a calmer hour like this, early enough that the rowdiest drunks are still collapsed somewhere convenient, Nassau hums with a strange energy, like a town that's always one bad idea away from becoming a historical footnote. You smell wood smoke from a tavern you can't see, hear someone hammering a plank back into a ship hull, and catch snippets of laughter breaking through the thick heat. You're not here to mingle. You're here to understand what it meant for Anne to step into this place and feel something open inside her. A mainstream history point drifts through your mind. Nassau was a haven for outcasts, privateers, former sailors, political runaways, and anyone who decided taxes were more of a concept than an obligation. Here, the so-called pirate code was less about discipline and more about negotiation. Crews voted, divided plunder somewhat fairly, and occasionally behaved better than the governments trying to arrest them. Academics still debate whether pirate republic life was genuinely democratic or just chaotic enough to look that way. You can imagine the conferences. Two historians sweating through linen suits, arguing over whether wildly improvised governance counts as a political system. You weave your way past a row of weather-beaten buildings that lean at angles no architect would approve of. The doors hang open, even when the rooms are empty, as if refusing to be closed against the humid wind. You pause by a stray barrel, touching its surface. It's warm, sticky with dried sugar, and buzzing faintly with a fly that seems personally offended you're intruding. You step back. The fly has boundaries, even if the pirates don't. Somewhere deeper in the maze of streets, you sense the memory of Anne walking fast, purposeful, trying to carve out a life in a place that promised freedom without offering stability. You follow that invisible trail, feet sinking into shifting sand as you enter the market square. It's quieter than usual tonight, only a few lanterns still flickering. You see fish nets drying on wooden frames, their shadows dancing on the ground like webbed silhouettes. You let your fingers trace one of the ropes, rough, fraying, carrying the briny scent of hours spent pulling against the sea. You catch a glimpse of a strange little historical oddity. Nassau residents often used conch shells not just for food or decoration, but as makeshift signal devices, blowing into them to announce everything from incoming ships to, occasionally, running out of beer. It's a detail historians mention with an apologetic shrug, mostly because no one knows exactly how often the beer situation was the reason for the horn. The academic debate remains surprisingly spirited. You wander toward the harbor again, where long shadows stretch across the docks. You can feel why Anne gravitated here. Nassau wasn't just a place to exist. It was a place where existence didn't require explanation. Here, no one asked her to lower her voice, soften her step, or fit into a role that had already been assigned to her. The air carried an unsaid permission. Be loud if you want. Be quiet if you want. Just don't be boring. Boards of the dock shift beneath your weight as you walk along them. Some feel loose, some feel firm. All feel like they have absorbed centuries of secrets. You stop at the end, where the water laps lazily against barnacle-coated posts. In the distance, ships bob with the same stubborn persistence as people who refuse to leave a bar at closing time. You watch the reflections shimmer, stretched, broken, reformed, mirroring the way Anne's identity stretched and reshaped itself the longer she lived here. You lean forward, catching a breeze that evaporates some of the heat from your skin. This is where Anne first felt the pull of the sea, not as an escape, but as an invitation. You understand it now, the openness, the possibility, the sense that life didn't have to be handed down through expectations. You rest your palms against the edge of the dock, feeling the old wood warm beneath your touch. Nassau was messy, unpredictable, occasionally dangerous, but it was hers. The first place that didn't shrink her, the first place that felt big enough. A gull screeches overhead, a sound that seems to be 60% hunger, 40% judgment. You glance up, and the bird drifts away, unimpressed with your lack of breadcrumbs. You watch it glide into the glowing sky, and somehow, that simple wing beat feels like the next step in Anne's journey. The moment she begins to lift off, metaphorically, from the weight of her past. As the heat presses closer again, you close your eyes and picture her walking through these same streets, with that faint forward-leaning posture of someone who already knows the world won't contain her much longer. The air shimmers, the dock creaks, and the horizon waits. Every story of rebellion needs a birthplace. For Anne, it was Nassau. For you, it's this quiet moment, standing on the warm wood, listening to a history that's still very much awake. The heat of Nassau softens into a low amber glow as you breathe in and step forward again, letting the night reshape itself around you. The harbor melts into the silhouette of a ship, Anne's ship, though it's not hers in the official sense. At least, not yet. You feel the planks under your feet again, but this time everything hums with a subtle tension, like the air has been wound too tightly and is waiting for someone, maybe you, to loosen the knot. The moon hangs lower now, smoky behind drifting clouds, and the faint scent of gunpowder threads through the breeze as if the ship has a pulse that runs on sparks. You wander toward the lower deck, following the smell. Sharp, metallic, oddly comforting in the way only dangerous things can be. The lanterns sway gently, casting ripples of shadow across the walls. Each flame flickers with that unpredictable confidence you only see in early colonial-era lighting technology, a reminder that fire was both a tool and a temperamental roommate. You take a careful step downward, the stairs creaking in a rhythm that says they've seen too much, but aren't ready to retire. The gunpowder room isn't loud, but it feels loud. It holds a kind of charged silence, thick, humming, waiting. Barrels line the walls, sealed tight, each one stamped with markings that look more decorative than informative. You brush your fingertip across one of them. The wood is cool, despite the heat outside, and the faint powdery smell clings to the air like it hasn't quite decided whether to behave tonight. This is where Anne's reputation began. Not from a heroic moment, not from a dramatic battle, but from a series of chaotic, borderline, ill-advised impulses that somehow never ended in immediate catastrophe. Here's the mainstream history note that drifts in like a half-remembered breeze. Pirate crews were often surprisingly diverse, not just in nationality, but in personality. Ships were floating ecosystems of temperament: the brooding navigator, the optimistic carpenter, the musician who carried exactly one instrument in 3 questionable sea shanties, and then, of course, the wild card, the person who could either save the day or accidentally light something important on fire. Anne was, depending on which historian you ask, somewhere between calculated risk and walking hazard sign. Scholars still debate how much trouble she actually caused in these early years, though most agree the stories tend to exaggerate the chaos for entertainment. Still, you can't walk into this room without sensing the faint echo of something combustible. You crouch near a crate, watching dust motes drift through a shaft of light. The stillness around you is so complete that even your breath feels like it might disturb the equilibrium. And then, because memory has a sense of humor, you hear the faintest clink of metal, a dropped tool, a shifting barrel, or a very gentle, historically plausible accident brewing. You straighten slowly. The air tastes sharper. You can imagine Anne here, moving too quickly, thinking too boldly, convinced that if something needed doing, she should just, well, do it. You step deeper into the room, your boots echoing against the planks. You run your hand along a fuse rope coiled neatly on a hook. It's coarse, fibrous, and looks like the kind of thing that would absolutely betray you the moment you trusted it. The crew probably thought so too. Tools were shared, but trust was earned, and in this dim lantern glow, You sense one of Anne's early lessons unfolding, that fear and courage often look identical in the dark. There's a peculiar little historical oddity you pick up as you wander. Some pirate ships stored citrus peels in gunpowder rooms because they believed the scent kept pests away. Modern scientists are still split on whether that actually worked, though the debate is surprisingly heated for a topic involving oranges. You catch a faint citrus note now, not strong, more like a memory of one, as if the room is humoring you with a detail it never really meant to preserve. You place your palm against one of the support beams, and it vibrates faintly with the movement of the ship. Up above, the ocean murmurs and the crew snores, and the world carries on, unaware of the sparks that small acts of rebellion can ignite. You can almost see Anne here, leaning against a barrel, thinking too loudly, planning too boldly. She wasn't reckless for recklessness' sake. She was restless in a way the land couldn't satisfy. This room, this hum, this chance to learn the language of danger, it became part of her education, her awakening. The lantern beside you flares, its flames stretching upward as if reacting to some unseen shift. The shadows dance across the barrels in jagged waves, and you can feel a rising warmth that isn't entirely from the lamp. This is where Anne first learned that fear isn't the same as caution, that courage isn't always explosive. It's often quiet, slow, simmering in moments where no one is watching. You close your eyes and let the hum settle into your bones. The air thickens, the ship rocks, and in the soft rumble beneath your feet, you sense the beginning of transformation. Not a fiery one, not yet, but enough to light something inside her that won't extinguish again. When you finally step out of the gunpowder room, the cooler night air wraps around you like a damp cloth. The danger fades, but the weight of it lingers. The awareness that even the quietest corners of the ship hold the sparks that shape history. You exhale, steady, feeling the pulse of the night steady with you. Some beginnings aren't loud, some are simply charged. Anne's was both. The night exhales around you as you rise from the lower deck, leaving the dim glow of lanterns for a breeze that feels easier on your lungs. You step back into the open air, and the ship settles beneath you with the slow sway of something that has decided, for now, not to challenge the sea. The moon hangs higher again, clearer than before, as if the sky has polished it while you weren't looking. You follow its silver pull toward the stern, where the world feels wide enough for wandering thoughts. And this is where the idea of direction, real, imagined, borrowed, or improvised, begins to stretch itself across your path. You find a rusted compass first. It isn't dramatic. It's not glowing or humming or whispering prophecies. It's just sitting on a crate near a coil of rope, half forgotten, like someone put it down in a hurry and never picked it back up. You lift it gently, turning it in your hand. The metal is cold, mottled with age, and the hinge squeaks when you open it, as if protesting the interruption. Inside, the needle twitches toward north with the enthusiasm of a cat being woken for breakfast. Capable, but resentful. It's the kind of compass Anne relied on during her early voyages, functional enough to avoid disaster, unreliable enough to encourage improvisation. A mainstream historical point drifts into your mind. Navigation in the early 1700s wasn't precise. Mariners depended on instinct, basic tools, and the occasional educated guess, which is historians speak for, "We hope this works. Please don't panic." Latitude could be measured with some reliability, but longitude, forget it. Not until decades later would that puzzle get solved. Many pirate crews simply accepted that getting a little lost was part of the charm. Historians still debate how much navigational knowledge pirates actually had, though most agree they were better at reading the ocean than the romanticized chaos suggests. You tilt the compass, watching the needle lag, hesitate, and then settle with the confidence of someone pretending to know the answer on a group project. You smile to yourself. This feels appropriate. Guidance in Anne's world and yours rarely comes clean or absolute. Sometimes you have to accept the direction is a combination of star charts, messy instincts, and an occasional shrug. You rest your elbows on the railing, feeling the night breeze brush across your skin. It carries the scent of brine and pine tar, mixed with something faintly herbal, probably from the ship's small stash of dried plants that pass as medicine. You look out at the wide black water, noticing the faint trail of phosphorescence swirling beneath the ship's wake. It's like the ocean is leaving footnotes behind you, tiny, glowing reminders that movement leaves marks even when you're not trying. You take a slow breath. The sky above looks like a map someone spilled glitter on, constellations stretched thin across the dark. You trace a few with your eyes, the curve of Orion's belt, the arc of the Big Dipper, the soft sweep of stars that sailors once used to judge distance when nothing else made sense. The night feels steady, but not static, like something is turning beneath the surface. You turn the compass in your hand again. A strange, lesser-known historical detail floats up as you stare at the tarnished metal. Some pirates modified their compasses with personal scratches or symbols, little marks that meant nothing to anyone else, but served as reminders of home, fear, or loyalty. A few rare compasses found in shipwrecks carry etchings of hearts, initials, or crude animal figures. One even had a tiny, almost childish fish carved on the underside. Scholars still debate what it meant. Was it sentimental? Was it a joke? Was it just someone very bad at drawing? The academic arguments are unexpectedly passionate. You close the lid of the compass with a soft click and let your hand rest on it. It's heavier than you expect. Or maybe it's just the idea of direction that feels heavy tonight. You glance toward the horizon. It's barely visible, more guessed than seen, but it still pulls at you the way it must have pulled at Anne. The way possibility pulls at anyone who's ever stood on a deck at night and wondered where they should go next. You wander slowly across the deck, letting your feet choose their own course. The wood beneath you creaks a little more with each step, almost in conversation. You trail your hand along the railing again, tracing grooves worn by years of storms, sun, teeth of salt, and gripping hands. These planks have been pointed at dozens of destinations by dozens of people, each believing for a moment that the compass belonged to them and that the world would bend accordingly. The night shifts as you move. The clouds part overhead, letting moonlight spill across the deck in wide strokes. You pause and look down at your shadow stretching across the boards, long, softened at the edges, the kind that makes you look more certain than you feel. Shadows do that. They flatten doubts into simple shapes. You turn the compass over once more. You imagine Anne doing the same, standing on this very deck, holding a tool that didn't always point her where she needed to go. And yet, she moved. She improvised. She leaned into uncertainties with the grace of someone who knows that even when the needle wavers, the journey doesn't disappear. Maybe you felt that too. That half-drift, half-determined state, where the stars offer hints but no guarantees, and the sea listens but doesn't answer. You let that feeling settle in, a quiet reminder that direction is rarely a single line. It's a collection of intentions, adjusted as needed, often changed by wind and weather and whatever your heart insists on in the middle of the night. You finally set the compass down where you found it. The metal clicks softly against the crate. The needle quivers, then steadies, then tilts a little more, as if reconsidering. You know better than to give it too much credit. But you also know this. Even rusted compasses tell stories. Even the ones that hesitate still point somewhere. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough. The rusted compass's quiet click fades behind you as you drift toward a part of the ship that feels naturally darker, naturally more secretive, as if the air here knows to lower its voice. The moon narrows itself into a long silver line across the deck, just enough for you to follow without feeling lost. You move slowly, the boards beneath your feet sighing in a way that suggests they approve of the pace. The night feels different now, not dangerous, not heavy, just aware, like it recognizes what you're about to step into, the quiet space where alliances form, not with ceremony, but with presence. You stop near the starboard rail, where two shadows once stood often enough to leave a kind of imprint in the wood. One belonged to Anne, the other, Mary Red. You won't hear their voices, but you feel the shape of their companionship lingering in the night air, subtle and steady. You lean on the railing as they once did, letting the darkness settle around your shoulders like a coat just pulled from warm water. There's something grounding in the silence here, something that hints at unspoken agreements and shared glances that didn't need explanation. The historical point makes its entrance gently. Mary Red was one of the few women in pirate history who didn't just survive the life, she mastered it. Like Anne, she slipped into the world disguised, determined, and far more capable than anyone expected. And while their partnership has been heavily romanticized in stories, scholars still debate the exact nature of their bond. Were they allies, co-conspirators, friends who recognized themselves in each other? Every historian seems to carry a different theory, each insisting their version is the most sensible. You get the impression the truth was more fluid, more instinctive, more human. You rest your fingertips along the railing's grain, feeling each ridge like a heartbeat. This is where the two of them often stood during quiet hours, surveying the sea, reading the sky, sharing contraband snacks, probably, and occasionally judging the rest of the crew with synchronized disappointment. You can imagine the silent understanding between them, those soft moments where two people see each other not as legends, but as survivors shaping their own space. A stray rope swings nearby, brushing your arm as it moves. You glance at it and notice a tiny knot tied near the end. A simple loop, nothing decorative, but it brings a lesser-known detail to mind. Some pirates used small, nearly invisible knots as signals between trusted crew members. One tug could mean, "Follow me." Another, "We need to talk." And occasionally, "Absolutely do not go below deck right now." No records confirm if Anne and Mary used this system specifically, but many scholars argue it would have suited them. Others insist that's speculative nonsense. The debate persists, surprisingly intense for something involving rope. You look toward the mast, towering above you like a rib of some enormous creature. The moonlight runs halfway up before giving up, leaving the upper rigging in darkness. That in-between light feels symbolic. Anne lived in that threshold, between rule-breaker and strategist, between fear and ferocity. Mary, too. You imagine them leaning here, trading glances that said more than words ever could. Allies don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they form the way tide pools form, quietly, inevitably, in places where the world carves out a need. The ocean rolls beneath you, its sound low and full, like a giant folding and unfolding a heavy blanket just below your feet. You steady yourself and look into the water. It's black, glossy, endless, but dotted with flashes of bioluminescence that flare briefly, like thoughts surfacing before sinking again. You follow one of those flashes, then another, and in the flicker, you understand something. Hidden alliances don't always burn bright. Sometimes they glow in short sparks, visible only to those who know where to look. The breeze changes, colder now, cleaner, and you pull your arms in closer to your body. You take a few steps along the deck, letting your feet echo in the space where Anne and Mary once walked shoulder to shoulder. The rhythmic tap of wood beneath your boots feels meditative, almost ritualistic. You sense their presence here not as ghosts, but as momentum. Two women who refuse to be quieted by the narrow roles the world offered them. Another historical detail drifts in, odd but almost endearing. Some accounts say Mary kept her disguise so convincingly that new crew members didn't realize she was a woman until months into a voyage. Others claim Anne recognized her almost immediately. Scholars still argue which version is true. You smile. Of course they do. History loves mystery, and people love filling gaps with theories that sound clever at conferences. You reach the stern, where the ship's wake trails behind like a ribbon unraveling into the dark. The churned water glows faintly with blue-green flecks, shimmering as if stirred by some luminous creature. You rest your palms on the rail and breathe in slowly. This is the part of the night where everything feels suspended. Movement without rush, direction without pressure. It's easy to picture Anne and Mary standing just like you, quietly watching the water break apart and reform, understanding that survival often depends on knowing when to speak and when silence says more. You exhale. The air cools your teeth. The ocean murmurs. And the imprint of their partnership, quiet, steady, unspoken, wraps itself into the moment. Two women hidden in plain sight. Two shadows leaning together for strength. Two lives bending the rules without asking permission. And you, standing where their paths once crossed, let the night fold the memory into you gently, like a knot tied in the dark, invisible but unmistakably there. The night settles deeper around the ship, thick and velvety, the kind of darkness that doesn't press in. It simply exists, like a vast room the world forgot to turn the lanterns on for. You walk toward the bow this time, following a trail of soft creaks and the whisper of canvas shifting above you. The sea has quieted to a slow, even breathing, almost as if it's trying not to disturb what you're about to find. Up ahead, perched near the figurehead, like someone who got tired of standing and decided to claim the nearest mythical carving as personal seating, sits a memory of Calico Jack himself, not the man, but the space he occupied. It's easy to imagine him lounging here, all swagger and decorative choices, while the rest of the crew muttered about how their captain spent more time arranging his appearance than strategizing. You glance at the carved wooden figurehead, a woman with flowing hair and a posture that says she has better things to do than haunt the front of a pirate ship. Fair enough. You rest a hand on the rail and let your mind drift into the historical point of the night. Calico Jack wasn't famous for brute strength or tactical brilliance. No, his legend came from something much pettier and somehow more charming: his fashion sense. The man genuinely loved colorful calico clothing, enough that it earned him a nickname that completely overshadowed every other detail about him. Scholars note this with a tone that wavers between amusement and mild academic despair. Imagine dedicating your career to maritime history, only to write, with a straight face, "His trousers were of notable vibrancy." You shuffle forward until you're near the bowsprit, the long timber jutting out like the ship's confident chin. The wood is cool beneath your palms, and the breeze rushing past carries traces of salt and something faintly floral. Sea lavender, maybe, blooming miles away on land you'll never touch tonight. You look down and watch the waves split at the bow, forming a V that glows with scattered bioluminescent sparks. It's as if the ocean is opening itself just enough to guide you forward. The wind picks up, tugging softly at your clothes. You imagine Calico Jack here, adjusting some flamboyant sash, absolutely refusing to let the weather diminish his personal flair. Meanwhile, Anne, standing nearby, would be giving him an expression that suggested she was evaluating whether fashion choices were grounds for mutiny. Mary might have been snickering behind her sleeve. Historical accounts don't mention this dynamic, but the vibe is undeniable. There's a soft thump above you, a loose rope hitting mast, then another. You glance upward and see the rigging sway as if stirred by footsteps you can't quite hear. The air carries a hint of movement, a memory of the night Anne and Mary fought alongside the crew while Calico Jack hid in the hold. Scholars love reminding people of that part. Some relay it delicately, others with a tone that might as well say, "I mean, come on." You take a deep breath, letting the air fill your lungs slowly. The bow always feels different from the rest of a ship, more exposed but more honest. Here the wind doesn't just brush past, it speaks. The sea doesn't just move, it reaches. This is where the future arrives first, where danger, wonder, storms, and new horizons all make their first announcement. It makes sense that a man obsessed with appearances stood here often. It gave him the stage he craved. But it also makes sense that Anne and Mary stood here too, reading the water, weighing choices, and quietly preparing for whatever came next. Your gaze drifts upward again. The sky is enormous now, no sails blocking your view. Just a sweep of stars sprawled across the black, like someone spilled a jar of salt on velvet. Some constellations you recognize. Others look like they've rearranged themselves out of pure mischief. You find the curve of the Big Dipper, then trace a line toward Polaris. The North Star hangs steady, unbothered, the cosmic equivalent of someone who shows up on time without being asked. A thought flickers through your mind. Sailors weren't just tough, they were mathematicians with better tans. Navigating the ocean before GPS required trigonometry, observation, and the patience to reconcile charts drawn by people who might have been drunk or seasick, or both. Some historians insist Calico Jack wasn't particularly skilled at this. Others argue it's exaggerated. You get the feeling no one will ever agree, mostly because arguing is half the fun in academia. A cold gust slides across your shoulders, urging you to shift closer to the mast for warmth. You do. There's comfort here, in the vastness and the vulnerability, in standing exactly where decisions were made that shaped the fates of everyone on board. This is where hope sharpened into resolve, where fear softened into acceptance, where reckless dreams took their first breath. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the wind hum against your ears. The ship moves beneath you, gentle, sure, alive. When you open your eyes again, the horizon looks slightly different, as if stretching, waking, adjusting itself around the ship's quiet glide. Calico Jack's legacy, messy, colorful, debatable, lingers here, but not as a haunting. More like a reminder that history is made not only by grand tacticians or poetic heroes, but also by people who never learned to tone themselves down. You lean forward, feeling the wind push lightly against your chest. The stars blink above you. The sea glows below you, and the bow, the ship's quiet arrow, keeps pointing toward what's next. Somewhere behind you, the deck creaks. A rope swings. The night breathes, and you move with it, carried forward like a thought that hasn't yet finished forming. The ship drifts into a quieter pocket of the night, the kind where even the waves seem to lower their voices out of courtesy. You find yourself walking along the deck with the slow, unhurried steps of someone moving through a half-forgotten dream. Lantern light flickers along the railings in soft, uneven pulses, just enough to outline the world without insisting you stay fully awake inside it. That's the thing about these old vessels. They glow like memory rather than electricity. You angle toward the starboard side, where the ocean stretches into a wide, moon-brushed emptiness. There's something about the water tonight, smooth, dark, patient, as if it's giving you permission to dive into the quieter corners of Anne Bonny's story. The loud chapters get more attention, of course. The battles, the disguises, the arrests, the bold declarations that may or may not have happened exactly as the legends say. But the quieter chapters, those are the ones that stay with you the longest. You lean against the railing and breathe in the deep salt of the Atlantic. The wind presses against your cheek in a cool, steady line. Somewhere behind you, the ship groans as if adjusting its old bones. The moon hangs low and full, tossing a silver path across the water that looks almost deliberate, like a road painted for someone who needs direction but isn't quite ready to admit it. Tonight's piece of history settles gently around you. Anne Bonny's beginnings in the American colonies weren't exactly quiet, but they were far more complicated than the dramatic folk tales like to admit. You picture the marshlands of South Carolina, the humidity thick enough to be a condiment, the wild green tangling in every direction. The colonies, still trying to decide whether they were rugged frontiers or ambitious social experiments. Anne grew up in the middle of that contradiction, and you can almost imagine her wandering the muddy paths with a stubborn streak already sharper than the tools in her family's shed. A strange little fact drifts into your mind like driftwood. Early colonial laws in the Carolinas were notoriously inconsistent. At one point, the legal code technically allowed for trial by ducking for moral offenses. Yes, literally dunking people in water. Historians still debate whether this was ever actually enforced, or merely an alarming footnote of administrative creativity. But the fact that such a thing existed at all tells you something about the chaotic blend of European rules and New World improvisation that shaped Anne's childhood. A soft thud sounds above you, a rope swinging against the mast in the slow rhythm of a drowsy heartbeat. You let it pass through your awareness without effort. Everything feels slower now, like the night is trying to stretch time just enough to let you linger in the past. You picture Anne as a young woman, restless in a world that kept trying to define her before she had a chance to define herself. Remember, this was an era when women were expected to remain firmly vertical extensions of domestic furniture. Yet Anne had that unmistakable spark that the historical records, scattered, incomplete, occasionally contradictory, can't quite hide. Scholars still argue whether specific events in her youth are exaggerated, misreported, or invented entirely by later storytellers who loved a good rebel narrative. But even with the debates, the pattern emerges clearly. Anne was never going to stay in one place long enough for anyone else to decide her story. You shift your weight and feel the ship sway beneath you, a slow roll that nudges your balance rather than interrupting it. The night air is colder now, the kind of cold that feels like it's trying to remind you you're alive without actually being rude about it. You pull your arms a little closer, and your breath comes out as a faint cloud. There's something soothing about imagining the marshes and colonial streets merging into memories that nudged Anne toward the ocean. Maybe it was the environment, the constant movement of traders, sailors, rumors, and ideas drifting through port towns like a tide no one could stop. Maybe it was the simple magnetic pull of freedom, a feeling stronger than the social fences built around her. Or maybe it was the stubborn realization that the world she lived in wasn't designed for someone like her, so she'd have to redesign the world. A tiny splash breaks the surface of the water, not loud, not startling, just a neat, polite plunk. Probably a fish, or possibly a very cocky shrimp. Marine biologists will tell you shrimp are weirdly bold at night when no one is watching. Well, almost no one. You rest your chin briefly on your arm and stare into the dark. The moon's reflection shivers across the waves, splitting and reforming in an endless little dance. Something about that shifting shimmer makes you think of the way stories about Anne evolved, each retelling bending a little differently, but somehow preserving the same fierce, unquiet core. Another historical detail drifts back up. Many colonial families used the sea not as an escape, but as necessity. Trade routes were lifelines, markets, communication channels, and occasionally floating gossip networks. Ships brought wealth, but also danger, disease, and unpredictable news. Growing up around that constant flux must have planted early seeds in Anne's mind. The idea that the world could be larger and stranger than any one settlement's expectations. The ship rolls again, gentle as a rocking cradle. Lantern light slips across the deck in soft arcs. You let your eyes half close, listening to the muted splash of water against the hull, the long sigh of timber expanding and settling. The night has folded itself around you, thick and warm, like the world is offering you an oversized blanket made of dark sky. You exhale slowly. The memories, the history, the speculative pieces scholars still argue over. All of it weaves together into something steady and alive beneath your feet. Anne's early years weren't a prologue. They were a fuse, a slow burn, the beginning of a path that would eventually collide with salt, storms, rebellion, and a moonlit ship like this one. You keep your hand on the railing, letting the night draw you forward, deeper, softer, into what her life is becoming beneath the surface of the sea. The night has mellowed into a soft, velvety blue, the kind that settles gently over your shoulders like a shawl, borrowed from someone who knew you'd get cold before you admitted it. You drift toward the center of the deck, guided more by instinct than intention, your feet moving in slow, steady arcs that match the ship's quiet breathing. The lanterns here sway in a mild, almost conversational rhythm, casting warm, honey-colored reflections across the planks. Everything feels slower, deeper, like the whole ship is encouraging you to wade into another memory. You pause near a coil of rope, one of those perfectly imperfect piles sailors swear is organized, even though it looks like nautical spaghetti. Just beyond it sits one of the ship's battered crates, the kind that has been repurposed so many times it's practically in its retirement years. You ease yourself down onto it, and the wood sighs under your weight, as though grateful someone finally decided to sit instead of stomp around. A faint wind skims across the deck, carrying with it a whisper of salt, tar, and something faintly herbal. Maybe rosemary, maybe wishful thinking. You settle deeper into the stillness, and the chapter waiting for you rises up like the tide. Anne Bonny's early marriage, the pivot point that nudged her toward the sea. You picture Charles, her husband, whose name appears in historical documents with a kind of academic shrug. Scholars disagree on almost everything about him: his temperament, his ambitions, even his competence. Some argue he was charming but impractical. Others insist he was ordinary in every possible way, the kind of man who fades from memory even as you're looking at him. And of course, there's the theory, still debated, that he may have married Anne for access to her father's influence. But honestly, historians argue over this like it's an unsolved math problem, complete with footnotes and mild passive-aggressive phrasing. You pull your legs up just slightly, letting one knee rise higher than the other, a natural pose for listening to stories that stretch across time. The deck beneath you feels warm, storing the last remnants of the sun's heat. Above you, the sails shift with a soft, whispering rattle, like pages of a book turning themselves. Anne's marriage, according to surviving records, pushed her away from colonial life, not because marriage itself was unusual, but because expectations tightened around her like a corset 2 sizes too small. The world wanted her to settle, to behave, to function as a part of the polite social machinery of the colonies. But Anne wasn't a cog, and she definitely wasn't built for polite machinery. She had the temperament of someone who sees a fence and immediately wonders what's on the other side, who hears a rule and immediately tests its elasticity. And then comes the tiny, absurd historical detail that makes you smile. In some colonial towns, gossip was such a civic pastime that community warnings were occasionally announced by ringing bells. Imagine living in a place where someone's misbehaving again warranted a chime. Scholars aren't entirely certain how widespread the practice was, and they argue about it naturally. But the mere possibility says a lot about the social world Anne lived in. A world where every choice was commented on, categorized, and occasionally judged by committee. You inhale the cool air, letting the night settle across your thoughts like ink spreading on water. You picture Anne realizing that marriage wasn't going to give her freedom. It was simply another version of confinement dressed up in domestic expectations. Maybe she tried to settle into it. Maybe she really did try. You imagine her giving it a few solid attempts, the way someone tries to live with a hat that keeps slipping off. Eventually, though, she saw the opening. A chance to leave the colonies, to step aboard a ship, to follow the call that had always hummed beneath her ribs. There's a muted ripple against the hull, a small wave slapping the wood with the affection of a sleepy pet. The ship tilts just slightly, rocking you into a slow, comfortable sway. You look out toward the horizon, where the moon smears a pale streak across the dark. It almost feels like a timeline, stretching from the world she left to the one she would soon claim for herself. Anne's marriage becomes less of a romance and more of a hinge, a turning point, a moment when the life in front of her didn't align with the life inside her. You appreciate that. Most people assume transformative moments are dramatic, loud, cinematic. In reality, many are quiet, slow, the result of accumulating tension and the growing certainty that the world you're in doesn't match the shape of your bones. Another small splash echoes nearby, perhaps a fish, perhaps an overly confident crab making questionable life decisions. Maritime life is full of these mysteries. Sailors used to swear they could predict weather by the sound of fish at night. Scholars are still debating whether that's superstition, misinterpretation, or the kind of observation you develop when stuck on a boat long enough to start naming the planks. You let your gaze drift along the deck, the ropes, the masts, the shadows, the gentle roll. All of it mirrors the state Anne must have been in, not lost, but unmoored, not despairing, but restless, ready. The night deepens around you, and you feel the slow pull of the ship continuing onward, forward, away from everything behind it. Just as Anne did, the crate beneath you creaks, the sails breathe, and the sea stretches wide and open in every direction. This is where transformation begins, not with declarations, but with the quiet decision to move. The deck feels unusually still tonight, as if the ship itself is holding its breath, waiting for something unseen to unfold. You walk slowly, barefoot, feeling the gentle unevenness of the planks beneath your feet. Each step produces a small, compliant groan, the kind of sound that whispers rather than shouts. I remember everything. The moon hangs low, a soft silver crescent casting long, delicate shadows that stretch across the rails and coils of rope like memory trails reaching into the present. You make your way toward the ship's galley, drawn by the faint, lingering scent of herbs and old bread. It's not the aroma of a feast. It's the smell of survival, resourcefulness, and life continuing even when convenience isn't an option. You run a finger along the edge of a wooden counter, noting the worn grooves and tiny dents that tell the story of countless meals prepared, arguments settled, and decisions made without ceremony. This is the backdrop of Anne Bonny's early days at sea. Not the battles, but the quiet rhythm of daily life that forged her resilience. A historical point settles in your mind as you linger there. Pirate crews often managed food and supplies with a meticulous, almost obsessive care, despite the chaos surrounding them. Barrels of salted meat, dried peas, and ship-baked biscuits were rationed according to strict rules that could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe on long voyages. Historians still argue over how standardized these rations truly were, with some claiming the surviving accounts exaggerate precision, and others insisting pirate crews were surprisingly methodical. Either way, the discipline contrasts sharply with the freedom the open sea promised. You pause near a small window, looking out at the ink-black water glimmering under the moon. The reflection seems to ripple in time with your heartbeat. And as you watch, a small, almost absurd historical detail emerges. Pirates sometimes used fermented fruit or seawater mixtures to stave off scurvy. The concoctions were notoriously unpleasant, often described as liquid regret, and scholars still debate just how effective they were. Yet for Anne and her contemporaries, it was part of the ordinary, necessary discomforts of life at sea, a reminder that bravery often tastes bitter. A soft creak of the mast overhead pulls your gaze upward. You notice the shadows it casts across the galley floor, long and irregular, dancing like creatures that only exist when no one is watching. You imagine Anne moving through this space, quietly organizing, observing, planning. She didn't just participate in the voyage, she absorbed its subtleties, the way supplies were stored, the rhythm of crew interactions, the gentle but persistent hum of a vessel alive and unyielding. The air shifts slightly, carrying a whisper of salt, tar, and the faint, almost imperceptible scent of damp canvas. You trace the movement, realizing it mimics the cadence of life on board. Constant adjustments, small corrections, and the knowledge that even a slight misstep could ripple through the day. Anne would have learned this early, internalizing the lessons with a mixture of curiosity and stubbornness, understanding that authority on a pirate ship wasn't just declared, it was earned, negotiated, and occasionally challenged. You lean against a crate, feeling the solid weight beneath your hands. The shadows stretch and retract, the lantern flickers, and the night presses gently against the hull, reminding you that the world beyond the ship is vast, unpredictable, and unrelenting. Yet within these walls, within this carefully controlled chaos, Anne began to see the possibility of self-determination. Even minor tasks became exercises in autonomy, choosing the right barrel, timing the meals, tracking the tide, reading the crew. Each decision was small, but cumulatively, they built a sense of agency that would define her later exploits. A subtle splash reaches your ears, followed by the rhythmic lap of water against the hull. You close your eyes, letting the sound resonate in your chest. The ship rocks slowly, a cradle of wood and salt, teaching patience and balance. You can feel the lessons of endurance, observation, and timing threading through the night, echoing in ways that transcend history books. A minor, almost whimsical historical note drifts through your thoughts. Some pirate crews decorated their galleys with simple carvings, doodles, or initials scratched into the wood, a private record of their presence. Scholars debate whether this was a form of expression, superstition, or merely boredom taking a creative turn. Regardless, it's an intimate human detail, a reminder that even on a dangerous vessel, small gestures mattered. And you can imagine Anne noticing them, perhaps adding her own mark or silently appreciating the audacity of someone else's. The deck creaks gently as you stand, allowing your eyes to roam the soft luminescence of the night. The galley holds no battle scars, no dramatic confrontations, only the faint, persistent hum of life maintained against adversity. And in that hum, you sense the subtle shaping of a pirate queen, not forged in spectacle, but in quiet observation, subtle mastery, and an unspoken commitment to navigate the chaos on her own terms. You step back toward the open deck, feeling the wind and moonlight brush against your skin. The night stretches ahead, a patient companion, and as you walk, you realize that resilience, much like courage, often grows in these soft, shadowed spaces, quiet, unassuming, and infinitely enduring. The moon has climbed higher, spilling pale light over the deck in slow, deliberate strokes. You wander toward the mizzenmast, letting the ship's gentle rocking dictate your rhythm. The boards beneath your feet murmur with memory, each creak a note in a quiet, centuries-old melody. Everything feels slowed, softened, like the night has dipped itself in honey to keep you lingering just a little longer. You pause to watch the sails ripple, catching the subtle wind that brushes the ship's skin. The texture of canvas in moonlight seems almost tactile, a fabric that remembers storms and sunlight alike. Anne Bonny would have known this intimately, the feel of every rope, the stretch of every sail, the hidden tension beneath every plank. She learned quickly that the difference between a ship that survived and a ship that failed often rested in these tiny, persistent details. A mainstream historical note drifts into your thoughts. Pirate ships were complex ecosystems, surprisingly egalitarian compared to the rigid hierarchies of naval vessels. Crews shared spoils according to agreed rules, elected captains, and even had informal checks on leadership decisions. Historians still debate how revolutionary these arrangements were, or if pirates simply adapted practical solutions for survival. But it's clear that Anne's choices thrived in this system. She was at home in it, capable of bending norms without breaking them completely. You lean against the mizzenmast, your hand tracing the knots and textures of rope coiled around it. A minor but curious detail surfaces. Some pirate crews carried small personal charms, tucked into sails or hidden in rigging, meant to ward off misfortune. One recovered charm resembled a tiny carved fish, another a crudely shaped star. Scholars still argue whether these were practical talismans, reminders of home, or eccentricities born of long months at sea. It doesn't matter, really. The notion feels intimately human. You imagine Anne slipping one into her pocket, a quiet acknowledgement that superstition and self-belief often walk hand in hand. The wind shifts, carrying a faint scent of distant land. Pine, salt, and something indeterminate that reminds you of rain before it arrives. You inhale slowly, letting the air settle into your chest, noticing the subtle contrast between movement and stillness. Above, the moonlight outlines the rigging, a delicate latticework casting fleeting shadows across the deck. You can almost hear the whispered decisions of countless sailors who stood here before you, measuring the wind, the stars, the possibilities. Anne's instincts were honed in moments like this. She learned that observation, quiet, patient, unwavering, was a form of power. She watched, calculated, and acted, often in ways no one expected until long after the fact. And while popular stories highlight her audacity, historians still argue over how much of her reputation stems from genuine cunning versus the embellishments of gossip and legend. Either way, the impact was undeniable. A young woman moving confidently within a world that assumed she would be invisible. You walk slowly across the deck, brushing your fingertips along the railing. The wood is smooth and cool, worn by countless hands that guided, corrected, and steadied the ship over decades. It feels almost sacred in its ordinariness. The ocean reflects the moon in patches of liquid silver, breaking into small, glowing fragments as the waves fold under the hull. You watch them, mesmerized, noticing how the smallest ripple can refract light in unexpected ways. Life at sea, you realize, is not just endured. It is observed, adapted to, and appreciated in details both large and tiny. Another subtle historical note emerges. Pirate crews sometimes held informal councils under moonlight, using these quiet hours to resolve disputes or plan strategies. Participation wasn't dictated by rank alone. Respect and insight mattered. Scholars debate how structured these councils were versus how much was improvisation born of necessity. Either way, it's easy to imagine Anne leaning into these moments, measuring each voice, understanding the subtle currency of influence. You close your eyes briefly, letting the gentle sway of the ship and the soft rustle of sails lull your thoughts. The air is cool, the wood firm beneath you, the sea infinite in every direction. In this measured stillness, the complexity of Anne's life, the choices, the alliances, the quiet acts of rebellion, feels tangible. You sense the shaping of a pirate queen, not through spectacle alone, but through small, deliberate, almost invisible acts that ripple outward over time. A small splash echoes faintly, and you open your eyes to the moon's silver light dancing across the water. The ship continues its steady journey, carrying not just crew and cargo, but the imprints of countless decisions, daring and mundane alike. You lean into the moment, letting the quiet settle around you, the night stretching wide, patient, and almost indulgent. History, you realize, isn't just made in storms. It's also forged in these silent, measured hours when observation becomes understanding and understanding becomes action. The night has folded into a deep, near-silent lull, the kind of darkness that doesn't press, doesn't insist. It simply exists around you. You step carefully along the deck, letting the soft creak of the planks beneath your feet mark your presence without disturbing the delicate rhythm of the ship. Lanterns swing lazily, their flickering light tracing warm, hesitant patterns across the wood. You follow the shadows to the quarterdeck, a space that always feels a little more intentional, a little more reflective, like the ship reserves it for decisions whispered rather than shouted. Here, the wind carries more than salt. It carries a hint of tropical blooms mixed with tar, and something faintly reminiscent of old parchment. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the scents layer over each other. A subtle reminder that life aboard a pirate ship was an unending blend of necessity, environment, and improvisation. This is where Anne Bonny's reputation began to sharpen, not through grand spectacle, but through small, deliberate acts that threaded through her daily existence. A mainstream historical point appears gently. Pirate captains often relied on the loyalty and initiative of their crew more than strict hierarchy. Authority was earned, maintained through competence and reputation, not simply through title. Anne thrived in this environment, her audacity matched only by her awareness of timing, audience, and opportunity. Scholars debate the exact moments when she assumed leadership roles, with some suggesting she operated unofficially behind the scenes long before her exploits became public. History rarely gives certainty here, only educated conjecture. You lean on the rail, feeling the ship's slow, steady sway. Beneath you, the ocean murmurs a pattern both chaotic and familiar, a rhythm that has always existed yet feels intensely personal tonight. It's easy to imagine Anne pacing this very deck, measuring reactions, calculating consequences, and learning that influence can often be quieter, more nuanced than brute force. A lesser-known historical fact drifts into your mind. Pirate crews sometimes used simple songs and rhymes, not just for entertainment, but as coded messages. Lines that sounded like idle jokes could convey warnings, rally points, or instructions during raids. Scholars still argue how effective these methods truly were, whether they were reliable communication or clever improvisation, but the existence of such techniques illustrates the subtle intelligence woven into every day at sea. You can picture Anne smiling at the cleverness, recognizing both the ingenuity and the risk involved. The moonlight stretches across the quarterdeck, pooling near the ship's wheel, highlighting the grain and imperfections of the wood. Each scratch, each dent, tells a story of past navigators, of storms weathered and mistakes endured. You run your hand along the surface, imagining Anne touching it too, absorbing lessons in tactility as much as strategy. Small details mattered more than they often get credit for. The friction of a rope, the slack of a sail, the gentle slope of the deck underfoot. You glance toward the horizon, where the stars spread thin and bright. They are distant, constant, and yet deeply influential. The kind of silent witnesses that guided early sailors through nights both mundane and transformative. You imagine Anne mapping constellations not for navigation alone, but for comfort, for reassurance that even when the world felt precarious, a larger order existed somewhere above. The wind shifts, a soft, teasing brush against your face. You notice the tiny sounds, a barrel settling, a rope tugging gently, the faint slap of water against the hull. In these subtleties, Anne found her space, learning patience, timing, and observation. She understood that influence, like tides, can rise and fall without notice, and that mastery often comes from knowing when to act and when to wait. Another small, curious historical note comes to you. Some pirate captains maintained informal courts aboard ship to settle disputes, enforce codes, or decide punishments. Anne likely observed these closely, understanding the balance between justice and fear, and when to wield either. Scholars debate how consistently these courts operated versus being symbolic gestures, but their existence paints a vivid picture of pirate governance as a blend of pragmatism and showmanship. You stand silently for a moment, letting the night embrace you. The quarterdeck holds a calm authority, a space where decisions, quiet or dramatic, leave their imprint. The moonlight glimmers across the planks, shadows fold over each other, and the wind hums through the rigging like a low, approving chorus. In this environment, Anne's lessons crystallize: patience, awareness, subtlety, and the courage to act when the moment aligns. The ship continues its gentle sway, carrying the weight of night, history, and possibility. You close your eyes and let the sounds, scents, and textures settle into your bones, feeling the quiet energy of a life being shaped in subtle, deliberate steps. Here, on the quarterdeck, Anne Bonny's future begins to take its first quiet, resilient form. The night has softened into a velvet expanse, and you drift toward the forecastle, letting your hands trail along the worn wood, as if reading Braille written by centuries of footsteps. The ship rocks gently beneath you, steady and unhurried, its timber murmuring low notes that seem to echo the thoughts stirring in your own mind. Lanterns flicker faintly, throwing muted pools of light that dance across coils of rope, barrels, and rigging, reminding you that every object carries a story. Some bold, some quiet, all patient. You pause near the anchor chain, running your fingers over the cold metal links. Each link bears the subtle scars of labor and time, and you imagine Anne Bonny's hands tracing similar textures, learning the tactile language of the ship. The subtle art of care, repair, and attention to tools was as essential as courage at sea. Even a pirate queen needed to understand the vessel as an extension of herself. an ally in motion rather than a mere platform for rebellion. A mainstream historical note emerges. Pirate ships were often repurposed merchant vessels, adapted for speed, maneuverability, and survival. Modifications could include reinforced hulls, hidden compartments for loot, and adjustments to rigging that enhanced tactical advantage. Scholars debate the precise extent of these innovations and whether they were standardized or improvised by each crew. But the flexibility of the ships themselves mirrored the adaptability of their occupants. For Anne, understanding the vessel was as vital as mastering its social dynamics. The wind lifts slightly, carrying a briny freshness that mingles with hints of tropical blooms and tar. You breathe in slowly, letting the air thread itself through your senses, reminding you that even the smallest details of environment shape perception and strategy. You glance at the horizon, where moonlight fractures into dancing ribbons across the gentle waves. Somewhere within that reflective pattern, you sense the metaphorical currents that guided Anne's choices, the subtle tugs that led her toward both alliance and adventure. A small, peculiar historical detail surfaces. Pirate crews sometimes used signal flags, not only for navigation, but for secrecy. Tiny variations in knots or flag positions could relay messages intelligible only to those trained to interpret them. Some scholars argue that the system was informal and inconsistent, yet it exemplifies the ingenuity embedded in pirate life. Communication born of necessity, layered with creativity. You can imagine Anne observing, memorizing, calculating which subtle gestures carried meaning, understanding the value of both silence and signal. You step closer to the forecastle's railing, resting your palms on the smooth, worn wood. The sway beneath you is gentle, almost meditative, and the faint hum of the water against the hull becomes a lullaby of sorts. Shadows pool and stretch in soft arcs across the deck, reminding you that much of life at sea unfolds in partial light, in spaces where perception, patience, and intuition dictate action more than brute force ever could. Another historical aside drifts into your awareness. Some pirates maintained secret caches of items aboard ship, small keepsakes, hidden tools, or personal mementos tucked away in unnoticed compartments. Scholars debate whether these were purely practical, sentimental, or a mixture of both. You imagine Anne slipping something small and meaningful into a hidden nook, a token of memory, a talisman of presence, or perhaps simply a quiet rebellion against transience. The moon arcs higher, illuminating the folds of sail above you. You watch the patterns of shadow and light shift, noticing how the ship seems to breathe with its own rhythm, alive in the subtle gestures of canvas, rope, and timber. Here you realize mastery is quiet, a matter of patience, observation, and gentle insistence. Anne's legend may later be recorded in bold strokes, but the careful, measured attention to every detail of the vessel and crew forms the foundation upon which audacity can flourish. A splash punctuates the gentle sway, perhaps a fish leaping, perhaps a wave nudging the hull. It is trivial in sound, yet rich in presence, a reminder that the world continues to move, indifferent yet intimate, around the lives that navigate it. You trace the phosphorescent shimmer left in the wake, a fleeting, glowing pattern, beautiful and ephemeral, marking passage rather than permanence. Anne's choices, like the shimmer, ripple outward, influencing currents and trajectories long after the immediate moment has passed. You exhale slowly, letting the night wrap itself around your shoulders like a familiar cloak. Each sound, each texture, each small flicker of movement teaches a lesson in awareness and adaptation. And standing on the forecastle amidst the wind, moonlight, and quietly thrumming deck, you feel the shape of a life unfolding, strategic, observant, bold, but always, fundamentally, alive. The night seems to lean closer now, pressing softly against your ears, wrapping the ship in a quiet intimacy. You drift toward the aft deck, your feet tracing familiar grooves in the planks, each one telling a story of countless sailors who have passed this way. Lantern light flickers across barrels and coils of rope, tracing gentle arcs of warmth in the cool silver wash of moonlight. The air carries salt, tar, and the faintest whisper of wildflowers carried from a distant shore. It's the kind of night that encourages reflection rather than action, patience rather than haste. You pause by the captain's cabin, noting the polished wood of the door and the subtle scratches marking years of use. The cabin is a symbolic space, even in memory, a place of authority, secrecy, and decision-making. Anne would have known its power, and perhaps even understood that influence often came from proximity as much as title. Scholars debate how much she engaged with these spaces versus operating in the open, visible, and audacious areas of the ship. The truth, like many details in her life, likely falls somewhere in the in-between. A historical note rises softly. Pirate crews often had detailed articles, written codes of conduct governing behavior, shares of loot, and dispute resolution. These articles were surprisingly sophisticated, emphasizing fairness and accountability. Anne, with her keen mind and instinct for strategy, would have read them, memorized them, and quietly noted where the lines of authority could be bent without breaking. Historians argue about which versions applied to her crew and how strictly they were enforced. The debate continues, a reminder that the messy details of everyday life often matter as much as legend. You lean against the rail, letting your fingers trace the worn grooves in the wood, feeling the slow roll of the deck beneath your weight. The water beyond glitters with bioluminescent pulses, small, fleeting lights that wink and fade in the undulating black. It's easy to imagine these tiny illuminations as messages from the sea itself, as if the ocean knows the stories it carries and occasionally gestures to you in gentle flashes. A minor, curious detail surfaces. Pirates sometimes use tiny, almost invisible carvings on railings or beams as personal markers or secret codes. The symbols might indicate alliances, shared knowledge, or simply a mischievous claim to a place in a transient world. Scholars debate the exact meanings, but the practice reflects the intelligence and creativity necessary to navigate life aboard a ship where attention to detail could save or endanger you. You imagine Anne running her fingers across a symbol, smiling at the cleverness, absorbing both information and reassurance. The wind lifts slightly, tugging your hair and the folds of your coat in gentle rhythms. You notice the subtle creak of rigging and the soft slap of waves against the hull. Each sound threads together, forming a quiet orchestration that is neither frantic nor threatening, merely alive. Anne would have recognized this language, timing, movement, tone, long before she ever needed to draw a sword or issue a command. A fleeting splash echoes nearby, drawing your gaze toward the faint, phosphorescent wake behind the ship. The glow seems almost deliberate, a reminder that even in motion, moments can be ephemeral, beautiful, and significant. In the same way, Anne's presence aboard the ship was an undercurrent shaping events quietly, in ways that observers might miss until later, when the patterns become apparent. You shift your stance, taking in the expanse of water and sky. Stars shimmer overhead, constellations casting familiar, patient guidance. The horizon seems to fold into itself, and you feel the slow, rhythmic pulse of the ocean beneath the ship, a heartbeat of its own. Here, the night teaches endurance, observation, and the subtle power of presence. Another historical aside appears. Pirate crews occasionally use nighttime drills or signals to maintain readiness without alerting the world beyond the horizon. Scholars debate how consistent or effective these practices were, but the concept reflects the constant interplay of vigilance and secrecy that defined life at sea. Anne's awareness, intuition, and adaptability would have been honed in these quiet, watchful hours. The aft deck creaks softly beneath your feet as you lean into the railing, letting the wind and moonlight wash over you. Every small gesture, every flash of light, every echo of sound feels like a lesson carried from the past. Observation, patience, resilience, subtlety. You close your eyes briefly, letting the night embrace you fully. The ship continues its journey, a quiet, steadfast companion, carrying the history, choices, and presence of those who have walked its planks before. Here, on this deck, the world is vast, mysterious, and infinitely patient, and you are part of its gentle rhythm, moving forward without rush, without fear, guided by the quiet, enduring pulse of the ocean. The night has settled into its most tranquil phase, the kind where even the gentle sway of the ship feels deliberate, as if the vessel itself knows it's time to soften and slow. You wander toward the stern, footsteps quiet, almost reverent, letting the moonlight guide you across the deck. Lanterns sway lazily, their light pooling like warm tea over the worn wood, and the faint scent of salt and tar mingles with distant hints of tropical flowers. Everything feels deliberate yet effortless, a harmony between movement and stillness. You pause near the ship's wheel, running your hands along the smooth, time-worn spokes. This is a space of subtle authority, where decisions are rarely loud, but always consequential. Anne Bonny would have understood this deeply. Control at sea often comes from observation, anticipation, and knowing precisely when to act. Scholars still debate the moments when she truly influenced the course of her ship, some claiming she operated covertly behind the scenes, others insisting her presence was undeniable in every choice made. Regardless, the pattern of her ingenuity is unmistakable. A historical point drifts into your thoughts. Pirate crews were governed less by rigid hierarchy than by mutual respect, shared rules, and earned authority. Captains had to persuade, not dictate, and cooperation often determined survival. Anne thrived in such a system, navigating the fine line between social expectation and personal ambition. The debate continues over how these arrangements functioned in practice, revealing that history often sits in a space between legend and fact. You let your gaze wander over the rippling water, the moon casting a silver path that stretches endlessly to the horizon. A minor, almost whimsical fact comes to mind. Pirates sometimes used simple knots and ropes or subtle signal gestures to communicate discreetly during the night. Scholars argue about their consistency and efficacy, but the ingenuity behind them is undeniable. Anne, ever perceptive, would have absorbed these nuances, learning to interpret the language of the ship and its crew without anyone needing to speak aloud. The wind lifts slightly, brushing your face, carrying the hush of the ocean and the faint echo of distant waves. You inhale, noticing the mixture of salt and life that defines the Atlantic night. Beneath you, the deck creaks with a gentle, steady rhythm. Every sound, every shimmer of moonlight on the water, every faint movement of rigging becomes part of a larger pattern, a subtle instruction in patience, observation, and timing. A historical aside floats into your awareness. Some pirate crews maintained hidden stashes of supplies or personal mementos aboard ship. Scholars debate the purpose of these caches, practical, sentimental, or playful, but they reflect a human tendency to claim small corners of control in an unpredictable world. You imagine Anne slipping a small token into one of these spaces, a quiet act of presence that affirms her agency in ways both literal and symbolic. The stars overhead seem closer tonight, more attentive, and the moonlight creates faint trails across the water, guiding the ship gently onward. You feel the slow pulse of the vessel beneath your feet, a heartbeat synchronized with history, legend, and the quiet courage of those who have walked these decks before. Anne's life, filled with daring choices and subtle strategy, pulses quietly within this rhythm. You sense the careful layering of decisions that transformed her from a restless young woman into the figure history whispers about, a pirate queen in all but title, defined by presence, intellect, and tenacity. The air carries the faintest rustle of sails, the gentle slap of water against the hull, and the low, approving creak of timbers that have borne centuries of footsteps. You lean lightly on the railing, letting the night and ocean embrace you. Each detail, the shimmer of bioluminescence, the murmur of waves, the glow of lanterns, feels intentional, teaching the same lessons Anne learned, that patience, observation, and careful presence often create more power than bravado alone. And as the ship glides forward, leaving subtle ripples in its wake, you feel the quiet shaping of legacy, a life that influenced, inspired, and endured, even in moments unseen. The night is vast, serene, and patient, and the story of Anne Bonny unfolds softly within it, like a moonlit tide that touches everything without a sound. Drift now into sleep, letting the ocean's memory cradle you as your mind floats effortlessly into dream. Good night.